In the spring of 1754, the North American continent stood balanced on a knife's edge between two vast European empires. The French, having explored and claimed the great river systems of the interior, the St. Lawrence, the Mississippi, the Ohio, envisioned a sweeping arc of territory stretching from Quebec to New Orleans, binding their colonial possessions into a single imperial domain. The British, clinging to their prosperous colonies along the Atlantic seaboard, looked westward with hungry eyes toward this same wilderness, seeing opportunity, expansion, and the manifest destiny of English-speaking peoples to occupy this new world. Between these two powers stood the native peoples, the Delaware, the Shawnee, the Mingo, the Iroquois Confederacy, who had inhabited these lands for countless generations. They watched the European rivalry with a mixture of pragmatism and growing alarm, playing one empire against the other, seeking to preserve their autonomy and their homelands, even as the tide of history threatened to sweep them aside. For them, the Ohio country was not contested territory to be claimed by distant monarchs. It was home, hunting ground, the land of their ancestors. The stage was set for conflict. All that was needed was a spark, a single incident that would transform simmering tensions into open warfare. That spark would come in an obscure ravine deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness, a place so remote that many of those who died there probably never knew its name. The local Indians called it something that has been lost to time. History would remember it as Jumonville Glen. The land itself, deep in the Allegheny Mountains of southwestern Pennsylvania, 7 miles northwest of what would become Fort Necessity, lies a place where the earth seems to fold in upon itself. Jumonville Glen is a secluded ravine, a narrow valley carved into the ancient Appalachian landscape near present-day Hopwood and Uniontown in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. To find it, one must leave the modern world behind, following narrow park roads that wind through state forest land, past modest farms, and through tunnels of overhanging trees, until arriving at a small parking area that gives no hint of the historical weight this ground bears. The glen itself is a natural fortress and, paradoxically, a natural trap. From the parking area, a trail beckons downward into the forest. The trail is deceptive in its beginning, pleasant enough, winding between mature hardwoods, oak, maple, hickory, their canopies so dense that even on the brightest summer day a green twilight pervades. But soon the trail begins its descent in earnest. The terrain is thick with towering trees whose trunks rise straight and true, competing for sunlight in the dense forest. Massive boulders, some the size of small houses, punctuate the landscape. Glacial erratics left behind when the ice sheets retreated 10,000 years ago, or perhaps ancient pieces of the bedrock itself, broken free and tumbled down the hillside by countless cycles of freeze and thaw. The roots of the trees gnawed through the earth like the twisted fingers of forgotten giants, seeking purchase in the thin mountain soil, wrapping around stones, diving between rocks, creating a web of wooden sinew that holds the hillside together. The hillside descends at a punishing grade. Geologists measure it at 20%, steep enough to steal the breath from your lungs as you make your way down, steep enough that on the return climb your thighs burn and your heart pounds. In 1754, there was no maintained trail, only game paths and the treacherous footing of loose rocks, exposed roots, and rain-slick leaves. Small rocks and exposed roots create a treacherous surface beneath your feet even today. You must watch every step, placing your boots carefully, sometimes catching yourself against tree trunks to control your descent. At the bottom of this descent stands the defining feature of the glen, an imposing stone cliff face, a wall of Burgoon sandstone that rises some 30 to 40 feet above the narrow valley floor. This is ancient rock, laid down in layers more than 300 million years ago, when this region lay beneath a vast delta system. The stone is scarred with ancient cross beds, diagonal layers preserved in the rock that show the direction of long-vanished river currents. Vertical fractures run through the stone, natural joints where water has worked its way into the rock over millennia, slowly prying it apart, creating this rugged, broken appearance of the cliff face today. These are the same processes that formed this ravine, water flowing downhill, always seeking the path of least resistance, cutting into weaker layers of rock, carrying away sediment grain by grain, year after year, creating over unimaginable spans of time this narrow valley with its protecting stone walls. The stone itself varies in color, gray in shadow, tan where the sun strikes it, sometimes showing hints of rust red where iron minerals have oxidized. Moss grows in the dampest places, and ferns cling to crevices where soil has accumulated. The ground is uneven, covered with leaf litter, fallen branches, and more of those ubiquitous rocks. It would be a difficult place to set up even a small camp. Finding flat ground for sleeping would be challenging, and the enclosed nature of the space would make it impossible to see anyone approaching from above. The glen is perhaps half a mile from the main Indian trail that wound through these mountains in 1754, obscured by the density of the forest. You could pass within 100 yards of the entrance to this ravine and never know it was there. This obscurity is precisely what made it attractive to someone seeking to hide, and precisely what made it so dangerous once discovered. The wilderness context. In 1754, this wilderness landscape covered most of North America, an endless sea of green that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. The great eastern forest, unbroken save for occasional native clearings and scattered European settlements along the coast, extended from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from Georgia to the Great Lakes and beyond. It was old-growth forest, the trees huge by modern standards, their trunks so large that 3 men with arms outstretched could not encircle them. The forest was alive with game. White-tailed deer moved in herds through the woods. Black bears were common, and the eastern elk, larger than their western cousins, still roamed these mountains. Gray wolves hunted in packs. Mountain lions, known then as panthers or catamounts, prowled the ridges. The rivers teemed with fish. Passenger pigeons passed overhead in flocks so vast they darkened the sky for hours, the sound of their wings like distant thunder. But the forest was not wilderness in the sense of being untouched. The native peoples had shaped this landscape for thousands of years through controlled burning, creating forest openings that attracted game, maintaining hunting grounds, clearing areas for agriculture. The paths that crisscrossed the mountains were not random gain trails, but established routes, highways of the forest, connecting villages and hunting camps, following the easiest grades over the mountains, fording rivers at the shallowest points. The isolation is palpable even today, when Jumonville Glen lies within Fort Necessity National Battlefield, when rangers maintain the trails and interpretive signs explain the history. Modern visitors, standing at the bottom of the ravine, often comment on how quiet it is, how the sounds of civilization fade away, leaving only bird song, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind through the trees. In 1754, that isolation was absolute. The nearest European settlement of any size was days away through trackless forest. You were alone with the trees and the stone and whatever dangers the wilderness might hold. It is easy to imagine yourself transported back through the centuries to that fateful morning, standing where others stood, seeing what they saw, the stone, the trees, the narrow confines of the ravine, the vulnerability of anyone caught at the bottom with armed men on the heights above. Part 2. The Road to War. Imperial Rivalry. To understand what happened at Jumonville Glen, one must first understand the broader context of imperial competition in North America. By the middle of the 18th century, both France and Britain had been expanding their colonial holdings for more than a century. Both empires had invested blood and treasure in the New World. Both believed their claims were legitimate, rooted in discovery, exploration, occupation, and treaties with native peoples. The French position was based on exploration. Jacques Cartier had claimed the St. Lawrence River Valley for France in 1534. Samuel de Champlain had founded Quebec in 1608. French voyageurs, coureurs de bois, and Jesuit missionaries had pushed deep into the interior, mapping the Great Lakes, descending the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. In 1682, René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle had claimed the entire Mississippi watershed for Louis XIV, naming it Louisiana in the Sun King's honor. The French colonial strategy was based on the fur trade rather than agricultural settlement. They established a network of forts and trading posts at strategic locations. Fort Frontenac on Lake Ontario, Fort Detroit at the strait between Lake Huron and Erie, Fort de Char in Illinois country, Fort Toulouse in Alabama, Fort Marepa on the Gulf Coast. These posts were lightly garrisoned, manned by small numbers of French soldiers and traders who maintained alliances with native peoples, exchanged European manufactured goods for furs, and nominally extended French authority over vast territories. The British colonies, in contrast, were based on agricultural settlement. They had far more European settlers, perhaps 1.5 million by 1754, compared to perhaps 70,000 French colonists in all of New France. But those British colonists were confined to a narrow strip along the Atlantic coast, hemmed in by the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists, especially in Virginia and Pennsylvania, looked westward with increasing hunger. They needed land for their growing populations, for their younger sons who would not inherit family farms, for speculation and profit. The Ohio Country, the region encompassing modern-day western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and parts of West Virginia, became the flashpoint for these competing visions. The French claimed it as part of the Louisiana Territory, accessed via the Great Lakes and the Allegheny River. The British claimed it based on Virginia's colonial charter, which theoretically extended Virginia's boundaries all the way to the South Seas, the Pacific Ocean, and on treaties with the Iroquois Confederacy, which claimed to exercise overlordship over the region's native peoples. The native peoples themselves had their own interests. The Ohio Country was home to the Delaware, Lenape, who had been pushed westward from their original lands in Pennsylvania by Iroquois pressure and European settlement. The Shawnee had villages throughout the region. The Mingo, Iroquois peoples who had migrated west, had established communities. These nations resented both European powers' claims to sovereignty over their lands, but saw opportunities to play the French and British against each other, to extract favorable trade terms, to preserve their autonomy. The Ohio Company. In 1747, a group of Virginia gentlemen, including the Washingtons, the Lees, and the Fairfaxes, some of the colony's most prominent families, formed the Ohio Company. King George II granted them 200,000 acres in the Ohio Country, with the promise of 300,000 more if they could settle the initial grant. The company's plan was to establish settlements, build forts, and monopolize the fur trade in the region, all of which directly threatened French interests. The French response was swift and decisive. In 1749, Pierre-Joseph Céloron de Blainville led an expedition down the Allegheny and Ohio rivers, burying lead plates at various points to symbolically reclaim the territory for France. He found British traders among the native villages and ordered them to leave. When they refused, he reported back to his superiors that force would be necessary to expel the British from the region. In 1753, the French began construction of a series of forts to solidify their control. Fort Presque-Isle on Lake Erie, modern Erie, Pennsylvania; Fort Le Boeuf at the portage to French Creek, modern Waterford, Pennsylvania; and Fort Mahaut at the junction of French Creek and the Allegheny River, modern Franklin, Pennsylvania. These forts formed a supply line from Lake Erie to the headwaters of the Ohio River. Virginia's lieutenant governor, Robert Dinwiddie, who was himself an investor in the Ohio Company, saw these French forts as intolerable incursions on British territory. In October 1553, he sent a young Virginia militia officer named George Washington to deliver a letter to the French commander demanding that the French withdraw from the Ohio Country. Washington's first mission. Washington was only 21 years old when he volunteered for this mission. He was ambitious, physically imposing at 6 feet 2 inches tall, and eager to make his mark in the world. He came from Virginia's minor gentry. His half-brothers had inherited most of the family property, and George needed to make his own fortune. Military service offered a path to advancement, to land grants, to reputation and respect. Washington traveled through the wilderness in the dead of winter, accompanied by Christopher Gist, a frontiersman and surveyor, and several others. They reached Fort Le Boeuf in December 1553. The French commander Jacques Legorder de Saint-Pierre received Washington courteously, read Dinwiddie's letter, and politely but firmly refused to withdraw. He said that his orders came from his own superior, the Marquis Duquesne, Governor-General of New France, and that he had no authority to abandon French posts. Washington returned to Virginia with this refusal, traveling through winter storms and near-death experiences. He almost drowned in the icy Allegheny River and was nearly shot by a native guide. He wrote a detailed report of his journey, which Dinwiddie had printed and distributed. The report made Washington something of a celebrity. Here was a young colonial officer who had braved the wilderness, confronted the French, and returned with intelligence about French strength and intentions. But the intelligence was troubling. The French were firmly established in the Ohio country. They had native allies. They were building more forts. If Virginia wanted to contest French control, military action would be necessary. The gathering storm. In the spring of 1754, Dinwiddie ordered a two-pronged response. First, he sent a small crew of workers under the command of Captain William Trent to the forks of the Ohio, the strategic point where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers join to form the Ohio River, modern Pittsburgh, to construct a fort. Second, he commissioned George Washington as a lieutenant colonel and ordered him to lead a company of soldiers to reinforce the fort once it was built. Washington set out in April 1754 with about 160 men. They moved slowly, cutting a wagon road through the wilderness as they went, dragging their supplies and several small cannon through the mountains. It was back-breaking work. Progress was measured in miles per day, sometimes less. The soldiers, most of them young recruits with little military training, struggled with the physical demands of the march. On April 17, 1754, a French force of approximately 500 soldiers, led by Claude-Pierre Picardy de Contrecoeur, arrived at the forks of the Ohio. The tiny British garrison, perhaps 30 dozen men working on the unfinished fort, had no hope of resistance. Captain Trent was away at the time, recruiting more workers. The French politely but firmly evicted the British workers and began construction of their own fort, which they named Fort Duquesne in honor of their governor-general. Word of the French seizure of the forks reached Washington while he was still struggling through the mountains. He was at Wills Creek, modern Cumberland, Maryland, when the news arrived. Dinwiddie ordered him to continue forward, to establish a British presence in the region, and to resist any French advance. Washington pushed on into Pennsylvania, his men cutting the road foot by foot. By late May they had reached a place called the Great Meadows, a natural clearing in the forest where a small stream meandered through marshy ground. It was the only significant opening in the endless forest, a place where Washington could camp his men and graze the horses. He decided to establish a base here while he scouted the area and waited for reinforcements. It was here, at the Great Meadows, that Washington received word that a French force had been spotted in the area. Part 3. The Night March. Intelligence from the Half-King. The intelligence came from Tonah-Cherison, known to the British as the Half-King. He was a Mingo chief, a complex and tragic figure who found himself caught between empires. Tonah-Cherison had lived through decades of European encroachment on native lands. He had seen how the French used their forts and trading posts to extend control over the Ohio country, how they demanded allegiance from native peoples, how they punished those who traded with the British. Tonah-Cherison resented French pretensions. The French called him and other native leaders children and referred to themselves as fathers, a paternalistic relationship that grated on men who saw themselves as sovereign leaders of independent nations. The Mingo and their allies wanted freedom to trade with whoever offered the best prices, wanted recognition as equals rather than subordinates, wanted the Europeans to acknowledge native sovereignty over native lands. When Washington arrived in the Ohio country, Tanacharison saw an opportunity. Perhaps the British, if properly supported, could drive out the French. Perhaps the balance of power could shift. Perhaps the native peoples could preserve their autonomy by allying with the weaker of the two European powers, using British resources and British arms to check French expansion. Tanacharison's scouts had been keeping watch on the region, monitoring both British and French movements. In late May, they discovered a party of French soldiers moving through the forest. The French appeared to be trying to stay hidden, camping away from the main trails. Tanacharison sent word to Washington at the Great Meadows. When Washington received word of the French presence, he faced a crucial decision. What were the French doing? Were they a diplomatic mission, coming to deliver another letter demanding British withdrawal? Were they scouts, gathering intelligence about British strength and positions? Were they an advance party for a larger force that would attack Washington's position? Washington believed they were hostile. He later wrote that the French were scouting his position with the intention of attacking. Whether this was true, or whether Washington was projecting his own fears and intentions onto the French, we cannot know. What we do know is that he decided to act preemptively. On the evening of May 27, 1754, Washington selected about 40 men, the most fit and experienced soldiers in his command. He gave them instructions to prepare for a night march. They were to travel light, carrying only their muskets, powder, shot, and perhaps a day's rations. They would move quickly and quietly through the forest, hoping to surprise the French before the French could surprise them. The rain began falling as evening turned to night. It was not a gentle spring shower, but a driving rain, the kind that soaks through clothing in minutes, that turns every low spot into a puddle and every trail into a stream. The temperature dropped. The men shivered in their wool uniforms, already damp from days of living and working in the forest. Washington led his 40 Virginians out of the Great Meadows as darkness fell. They followed narrow Indian paths that were barely visible even in daylight, nearly impossible to discern in the rain and darkness. The paths wound between trees, over roots, across small streams swollen by the rain. Water dripped from the leafy canopy above, running down the backs of necks, soaking through wool uniforms that grew heavier with every mile. The men moved in single file, each man following the dim shadow of the man ahead. They tried to move quietly, but silence was nearly impossible. Boots squelched in mud, equipment clinked and rattled, despite efforts to muffle it. Branches snapped underfoot, water dripped and splashed, the forest was alive with the sounds of rain. The men wrapped their muskets in oilcloth or canvas, trying desperately to keep the powder dry. A wet musket was useless. If water got into the firing pan or dampened the main charge, the weapon would not fire. Everything depended on keeping the powder dry. The men also carried their powder horns and cartridge boxes under their coats, protecting them as best they could from the relentless rain. 7 miles they traveled through that dripping wilderness, perhaps 4 hours of marching in the darkness, stumbling over roots, slipping in mud, always moving forward. It must have been miserable. Soldiers would later recall their feet squelching in their boots, blisters forming and breaking, the cold working its way deep into their bones. But they were young men, most of them, and they were on an adventure, following their young colonel toward action and perhaps glory. They arrived at Tenacharasan's camp as dawn began to gray the eastern sky. The Mingo warriors had taken shelter as best they could from the rain, but they were ready to move. Tenacharasan and perhaps a dozen warriors joined Washington's force. Together, Virginians and Mingos, they moved toward the French encampment. Part 4. Dawn at the Glen. Discovery. As morning light filtered through the trees, gray and misty, the sun not yet clearing the mountains to the east, Washington's scouts discovered the French encampment. It was located in a sheltered glen, hidden from the main trail by perhaps half a mile of forest. Washington would later describe it as a very obscure place surrounded with rocks. The French had chosen their campsite for concealment. If they were indeed on a diplomatic mission, as they later claimed, why hide themselves away in such an obscure location? If they had intended to openly approach the British with letters from their commander, why not camp on the main trail or send messengers ahead to announce their arrival? This apparent secrecy confirmed Washington's suspicions that the French were up to no good. But if the glen's obscurity made it a good hiding place, it also made it a trap. The French had positioned themselves at the bottom of a ravine, below a commanding stone cliff, with steep hillsides on 3 sides and limited avenues of escape. If discovered, they would be at a terrible tactical disadvantage. The French encampment. The French force consisted of approximately 35 men under the command of Ensign Joseph Coulon de Villiers, Sieur de Jumonville. Jumonville was 35 years old, a Canadian-born officer who had spent his adult life in military service on the frontier. He came from a military family. His father had been an officer, as were his brothers. He knew the Ohio country, knew the native peoples, knew the forest and the rivers. They had made their camp at the base of the rock escarpment, seeking shelter from the rain. Makeshift lean-tos had been constructed using canvas or bark, simple shelters that provided some protection from the elements. A small fire may have been burning, though if so it was carefully tended to minimize smoke. Fire was warmth and the ability to dry clothes, but smoke would reveal their position. The men would have been emerging from sleep as morning came, stiff from a night spent on the cold ground, hungry, damp, perhaps wondering how much longer they would be camped in this isolated glen. Some may have been seeing to their muskets, checking to ensure the powder was still dry. A wet musket was useless. If water got into the firing pan or dampened the main charge, the weapon would not fire. Everything depended on keeping the powder dry. The men also carried their powder horns and cartridge boxes under their coats, protecting them as best they could from the relentless rain. Tactical positions. Washington assessed the situation with the eye of a military officer. The glen created a natural amphitheater, with the French below and high ground surrounding them on 3 sides. It was an ideal position for an ambush. Washington deployed his Virginian regiment troops on the high ground overlooking the camp. He spread his 40 Virginians out along the rim of the glen above the French position, having them take cover behind trees and rocks. Each man found a position with a clear line of sight down into the glen. They crouched in the undergrowth, muskets at ready, waiting for Washington's signal. Tenacharasan and his warriors moved to block the far end of the ravine, cutting off the most obvious escape route. The Mingo warriors slipped silently through the forest. This was their element, their home terrain. They knew how to move without sound, how to use every bit of cover, how to position themselves for maximum tactical advantage. They took positions that would prevent any French soldiers from fleeing through the lower end of the glen. The trap was set. Washington had perhaps 50 or 60 men in position, overlooking no more than 35 French soldiers who were caught in the bottom of a ravine with limited visibility and no room to maneuver. The Virginians had every tactical advantage: surprise, numbers, position, and the ability to deliver fire from protected positions down into an exposed enemy. The French camp stirred with the growing light. Men emerged from under their makeshift shelters, shaking off the night's rain, stretching cramped muscles. They went about their morning routines, unaware that death was looking down upon them from the rocks and trees above. The first shot. What happened next remains one of history's most disputed moments. The accounts diverge sharply, colored by national pride, political necessity, and the fog of battle. French and British sources tell fundamentally different stories, and neither can be completely trusted. Yet all agree on certain facts. The battle began suddenly. It lasted approximately 15 minutes. Jumonville was killed. Most of his men were either killed or captured. According to the account of Denis Caningen, one of the French survivors, the Virginians appeared suddenly on the heights above the camp and immediately opened fire, without warning, without giving the French any chance to explain their presence or their mission. The French, startled from their morning routine, scrambled for their weapons as musket balls tore through the camp. According to Washington's own report to Governor Dinwiddie, written shortly after the engagement, one of the French soldiers saw the Virginians above the camp and fired his musket. This shot prompted Washington to give the order to fire, and the battle began. Perhaps both accounts hold elements of truth. Perhaps a French soldier, catching movement in the forest above, called out in alarm or raised his musket. Perhaps a nervous Virginian soldier, his finger on the trigger after hours of tension, fired without orders. Or perhaps Washington gave the order unprovoked, determined to strike before the French could organize a defense or escape. We will never know with certainty. What we do know is that the peace of that misty morning was shattered by the crack of musket fire. The battle. The Virginians opened fire from their positions on the high ground. The sound was devastating. 40 muskets fired in rapid succession. Perhaps not quite a single volley, but a rolling crash of fire that echoed off the stone walls of the glen, magnified and distorted by the confines of the ravine. Smoke from the black powder, white-gray and acrid, hung in the misty air, obscuring vision. The French were caught completely exposed. Some had been standing in the open. Some were emerging from shelters. Some were tending the fire or seeing to equipment. The musket balls, roughly .75 caliber, each one a heavy lead sphere, came down into the camp at angles, tearing through canvas, splintering wood, smashing into rock, and finding flesh. Men fell immediately. Some dropped without a sound, killed instantly. Others cried out, wounded, writhing on the ground. The survivors scrambled for their weapons, diving for cover behind rocks and trees, trying to make sense of what was happening. The French attempted to return fire. Those who could reach their muskets loaded with practiced speed, biting the paper cartridge, pouring powder down the barrel, ramming the ball and wadding home, priming the pan, cocking the hammer, aiming and firing. But they were at a devastating disadvantage.
They were firing uphill at targets they could barely see through the smoke and morning mist, targets that were protected by trees and rocks. The Virginians, meanwhile, were firing down into a confined space where any shot had a reasonable chance of hitting someone. Washington would later write, with the thoughtless bravado of a young man who had just experienced his first combat, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." When King George II heard this quote, he is said to have remarked, "He would not say so if he had been used to hear many." The old king knew what Washington had yet to learn. There is nothing charming about combat, nothing glorious about watching men die. The battle was brief and one-sided. Some French soldiers attempted to flee, running for the lower end of the glen. They ran straight into Tanacharison's warriors, who had blocked that escape route. Other French soldiers, realizing the hopelessness of their position, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Within 15 minutes, some accounts say as few as 10 minutes, it was over. The glen fell silent except for the moans of the wounded and the ringing in men's ears from the musket fire. White smoke drifted between the trees, the smell of burnt powder filled the air.
The prisoners. Washington's soldiers rounded up the prisoners, 21 men, frightened, some wounded, all uncertain of their fate. In European warfare, there were established customs for treating prisoners, particularly when both sides were ostensibly at peace. Officers who surrendered were treated with respect, given parole, sometimes even allowed to keep their swords as symbols of their rank. Common soldiers were disarmed and guarded, but generally not mistreated. But this was not European warfare. This was the frontier, where the rules were different, where European soldiers fought alongside native warriors who had their own customs and their own grievances, where the lines between combat and murder could become dangerously blurred. The diplomatic claim. Ensign Jumonville was wounded but alive. As Washington's men secured the scene, Jumonville attempted to explain his mission. He declared that he was serving as an ambassador, a diplomat sent by the French commander at Fort Duquesne to deliver a message to the British. He had been carrying orders from his commander, orders meant to warn the British away from the French-claimed territory, to deliver an ultimatum similar to the one Washington himself had delivered to the French the previous winter. Jumonville, struggling despite his wounds, may have attempted to read from the document he carried, a formal letter from Contrecoeur demanding that the British withdraw from the Ohio country. He would have tried to explain that attacking a diplomatic mission was a violation of the laws of war, that he and his men were protected by their status as envoys, that they should be released immediately. Washington rejected this claim outright. If the French were truly diplomats, why had they hidden themselves in this obscure glen, rather than openly approaching his camp at the Great Meadows? Why had they not sent messengers ahead to announce their coming, as was customary for diplomatic missions? Why had they been skulking through the forest, apparently trying to avoid detection? Washington believed, or claimed to believe, that the French were scouts, or the vanguard of an attack force, and that the diplomatic papers were merely a cover story to be used if caught. He may have genuinely believed this, or he may have been rationalizing what he had just done, justifying an attack that was looking increasingly problematic. The truth probably lies somewhere in between.
Jumonville may well have been carrying diplomatic papers, but he may also have been gathering intelligence about British strength and positions. In warfare of the frontier, where the line between peace and war was always uncertain, where European powers had not formally declared hostilities, it was common for such missions to have multiple purposes. Jumonville was probably both diplomat and spy, carrying official letters, but also observing, counting soldiers, noting fortifications, assessing the British presence. But whatever the truth of Jumonville's mission, what happened next would haunt George Washington for the rest of his life and provide France with the justification it needed to launch a world war. Tanacharison's action. As Jumonville struggled to make his case, Tanacharison approached. The Mingo chief had his own grievances against the French, his own reasons for being here, his own understanding of what this moment meant. Tanacharison stepped up to the wounded French officer. According to multiple accounts, including testimony from British soldiers who witnessed it, he said to Jumonville in French, "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père. Thou art not yet dead, my father." The phrase was chosen deliberately, laden with meaning. By addressing Jumonville as father, Tanacharison was invoking the paternalistic language the French used with native peoples, the language that cast Europeans as fathers and native peoples as children. But he was doing so ironically, bitterly, asserting that he would no longer accept that subordinate relationship. Then Tanacharison killed Jumonville. Some accounts say he used his tomahawk, splitting the Frenchman's skull. Other accounts are less specific about the method, but clear about the result. The Mingo chief personally executed the French officer. According to legend, Tanacharison then washed his hands in Jumonville's brains, a deliberate gesture of desecration meant to send a message to the French and their native allies. Whether this actually happened or is an embellishment added later is unclear, but it appears in enough contemporary accounts to at least have some credibility. The execution of Jumonville opened the floodgates. Tanacharison's warriors then turned on the other French prisoners, killing and scalping 9 additional men before Washington could intervene and stop the massacre. The young Virginia colonel stood frozen in horror as the glen became an abdoir, as men who had surrendered, who had laid down their arms and expected quarter, were cut down in cold blood. When Washington finally found his voice and commanded Tanacharison to stop, when his soldiers moved to physically protect the remaining prisoners, 12 French soldiers lay dead. 21 terrified prisoners remained, their faces spattered with their comrades' blood, uncertain if they would be next. The dead. According to French-Canadian records, most of the dead were from Quebec, Montreal, and other French settlements. Their names have come down to us through official reports and memorial records. Of Deroussel and Caron from Quebec City, Charles Bois from Pointe-Claire, Jérôme from La Prairie, L'Enfant from Montreal, Parry from Mille-Îles, Languedoc and Martin from Boucherville, and Labatterie from Trois-Rivières. These were not professional soldiers in the European sense, not men who had trained in military academies or marched in parade ground precision. They were colonial militia, habitants and coureurs et bois, who had answered their king's call, men who had families waiting for them back in the settlements along the St. Lawrence. They had farmers who had put down their plows, traders who had left their posts, men who had been going about their lives until called to serve. They were some of young, perhaps teenagers. Others were in their 30s or 40s, men with wives and children. They had traveled hundreds of miles from their homes, following the Great Lakes westward, portaging between waterways, paddling down rivers to Fort Duquesne, then marching into these Pennsylvania mountains on orders from their officers. They had done their duty as they understood it, and now they lay dead in a distant glen, their blood soaking into foreign soil, their bodies destined for hasty burial in a land far from home. Their families would learn of their deaths weeks or months later, as word slowly traveled back up the rivers to Montreal and Quebec. There would be widows and orphans, parents who had lost sons, children who would grow up without fathers. The ripples of this 15-minute battle would spread far beyond the glen, touching dozens of families, hundreds of lives.
Washington's horror. George Washington was 22 years old. He had led men in his first combat and watched it spiral into something dark and terrible. He had witnessed an execution, perhaps an assassination, and then a massacre. He had been unable or unwilling to prevent it, and now he had to live with what had happened. In his official report to Governor Dinwiddie, Washington would compress these events, downplay the post-battle violence, focus on tactical success. He would emphasize French duplicity and hostile intent. He would justify his decision to attack. He would portray the engagement as a clear military victory. But in later years, Washington would rarely speak of Jumonville Glen. It was not a battle he commemorated, not an action he boasted about. Unlike other engagements from his military career, which he would recount to detail to friends and fellow officers, Jumonville Glen remained a subject he avoided. One senses shame, perhaps, or at least discomfort with what had transpired in that ravine. The question would haunt him. Was Jumonville truly a diplomat or a spy? Had Washington been right to attack, or had he committed murder? And why had he failed to protect the French prisoners from Tanacarison's warriors? These questions would follow him through the years, never fully answered, never completely resolved. Part 7. The Aftermath. The Return to Great Meadows. Washington took the 21 surviving prisoners back to his main encampment at the Great Meadows. The return march through the forest must have been tense. The French prisoners, exhausted and traumatized, were under guard by men who had just fought against them. The Virginians themselves were coming down from the adrenaline of combat, processing what they had just experienced, perhaps beginning to understand the implications of what had happened. Washington's mind was surely racing with the consequences. He had engaged French forces. Men were dead. He had prisoners to manage, and the one French soldier who had escaped would soon reach Fort Duquesne with news of the attack. The French would respond, that much was certain. The only questions were how strong that response would be and how quickly it would come. At the Great Meadows, Washington wrote his report to Governor Dinwiddie. The letter, dated May 29, 1754, the day after the battle, provides Washington's official account of the engagement. He described how he received intelligence of the French presence, how he marched through the night to surprise them, how the battle unfolded, and how he achieved victory. But the letter is notable for what it omits as much as it includes. Washington mentions Jumonville's death, but does not describe how it occurred. He mentions French casualties, but does not detail the post-battle killings.
he portrays the engagement as a straightforward military victory, glossing over the ambiguities and the violence that followed the French surrender. Washington also began preparing for the French retaliation he knew was coming. He set his men to work improving the defenses at the Great Meadows. They began constructing a fortification, a simple stockade fort that Washington named Fort Necessity. It was a crude structure, built hastily from logs and earth, positioned in low ground where a small stream ran through the meadow. It was not an ideal defensive position, but Washington believed he could hold it against a French attack until reinforcements arrived from Virginia. The French response. At Fort Duquesne, the escaped French soldier arrived with news of the disaster at Jumonville Glen. The report must have struck like a thunderbolt. Jumonville was dead. Most of his command was either dead or captured. The British had attacked what the French considered a diplomatic mission, killing an envoy who had been carrying official letters. The French commander, Contrecoeur, immediately began organizing a response. He could not let such an attack go unanswered. French honor demanded retaliation. French authority in the region depended on showing strength, on showing native allies that France would protect its people and punish its enemies. Contrecoeur gave the command of the punitive expedition to Captain Louis Coulon de Villerizan, Jumonville's older brother. Villerizan had a personal stake in this mission. He would be avenging his brother's death. On June 28, 1754, Villerizan led a force of approximately 600 French soldiers, French-Canadian militia, and native warriors from several nations who had allied with the French. They moved with purpose, covering ground quickly, intent on finding Washington and making him pay for what had happened at Jumonville Glen.
The Siege of Fort Necessity. The French force reached Fort Necessity on July 3, 1754. Washington had perhaps 400 men, his original Virginia regiment reinforced by a company of British regulars under Captain James Mackay and some additional colonial militia. But many of his men were ill, weakened by poor food and the harsh conditions of frontier life. His fortification was incomplete, situated in a low, marshy position that would prove disastrous in rain. The French attacked in the morning, but they did not assault the fort directly. Instead, they took positions in the forest surrounding the meadow, firing from the cover of the trees into the exposed British position. It was a tactical decision that maximized French advantages, their superior numbers and their experience in forest warfare, while minimizing their exposure to British musket fire. Then the rain began. It poured down in sheets, just as it had on the night before the battle at Jumonville Glen. The meadow became a swamp. Water pooled around the fort, running into the trenches Washington's men had dug. The soldiers found themselves standing in water that rose to their knees, even their waists, while French musket balls whizzed overhead and occasionally found their marks. Washington's men fought desperately, returning fire as best they could, but they were in an impossible position. The trenches filled with water. Ammunition became wet and unusable. Men were wounded by French fire. The British had no shelter, no way to dry their powder, no way to cook food or warm themselves. They were exposed and vulnerable, taking casualties while are able to effectively strike back at an enemy they could barely see. As darkness fell, the French requested a parley. Captain Villiers sent forward an officer with a white flag, calling for Washington to negotiate terms of surrender. Washington was in no position to refuse. His men were exhausted, soaked, running low on ammunition. Many were wounded. The French could starve them out, or simply wait for the next day and resume firing from the safety of the forest. The confession. The negotiations were conducted in French. Washington did not speak French, so he relied on his interpreter, Jacob van Braam, a Dutch soldier of fortune who had accompanied Washington on his mission to Fort Ledebeuf the winter before. Van Braam's French was functional but far from perfect. He made errors, misunderstood nuances, failed to grasp subtle but important distinctions in meaning. The French presented terms of surrender. Washington and his men would be allowed to march out with honors of war, keeping their regimental colors and one small cannon. The wounded who could not walk would be left behind to be cared for by the French, with a promise they would be returned when recovered. The British prisoners taken at Jumonville Glen would remain in French custody to ensure British compliance with the terms of the surrender. These terms were relatively generous. The French could have demanded unconditional surrender, could have taken all of Washington's men prisoner, could have confiscated all weapons and supplies. The fact that they offered such lenient terms suggests that Villiers, despite his desire for vengeance, was a professional officer who understood the customs of European warfare. But buried in the terms was a phrase that would have enormous consequences. The French document referred to the action at Jumonville Glen as the l'assassinat of Jumonville, the assassination of Jumonville. Van Braam either failed to understand the significance of this word or translated it incorrectly as death or killing. Washington, unable to read the French text himself, believed he was simply acknowledging that Jumonville had been killed in the engagement, not that he was confessing to murder. Washington signed the document on July 4, 1754. It was a date that would later gain enormous significance in American history, though for very different reasons. On this rainy night in 1754, it marked Washington's humiliation. His first command had ended in defeat and surrender. He had lost a third of his men, either killed, wounded, or too sick to march. He was retreating in disgrace, having accomplished nothing except to provoke a war. The next morning, Washington's bedraggled column marched out of Fort Necessity. The men were exhausted, many wounded, all soaked and demoralized. They left behind their supplies, most of their ammunition, and the bodies of the dead. They began the long march back to Virginia, defeated and humiliated. The French burned Fort Necessity, erasing Washington's attempt to establish a British presence in the Ohio country. Then they marched back to Fort Duquesne, satisfied that they had avenged Jumonville and demonstrated French power in the region.
The diplomatic offensive. France wasted no time in exploiting Washington's signed confession. The document that Washington had signed admitting to l'assassinat of Jumonville became a propaganda weapon. French diplomats presented it at European courts, arguing that Britain had violated international law by attacking a diplomatic mission, that British colonial officers had murdered French envoys, that France was the victim of British aggression. King Louis XV's government published the document widely, distributing it to Allied and neutral courts throughout Europe. French newspapers printed stories about the assassination at Jumonville Glen, portraying the young Washington as a murderer and the British colonial enterprise as lawless and barbaric. The French argument was simple and powerful. Britain had struck first, killing French diplomats, and France was merely defending its territory and avenging its murdered countrymen. The British government found itself in a difficult diplomatic position. They could not simply deny what had happened. There were too many witnesses, too many documents, including Washington's own reports. Instead, they argued that Jumonville was not a true diplomat, but a spy, that he had been hiding in the forest rather than openly approaching the British, that his papers were merely a cover story to be used if caught. The British also argued that the Ohio country was rightfully British territory, that the French were the aggressors by building forts on land claimed by Virginia, that British colonial forces had every right to defend British territory against French encroachment. They portrayed Washington as a young officer who had acted properly in a difficult situation, who had defended British interests against French aggression. But the propaganda war was complicated by that signed confession. Washington had put his name to a document that, in French, admitted to assassination. However much the British government might argue that the translation was faulty or that Van Braam had misled Washington, the signature was genuine. The French had documentary evidence of British guilt, authenticated by the hand of the British officer who had led the attack. The slide toward war. The events at Jumonville and Fort Necessity occurred in 1754, but Britain and France did not formally declare war until 1756. The 2 years between these dates were filled with diplomatic maneuvering, military preparations, and escalating frontier violence, what historians sometimes call the undeclared war period. In North America, both empires rushed to reinforce their positions. The British sent Major General Edward Braddock with 2 regiments of regular troops to Virginia in 1755. Braddock was ordered to capture Fort Duquesne and drive the French out of the Ohio country. Washington, despite his defeat at Fort Necessity, was appointed as an aide to Braddock, serving as a volunteer without official rank, but providing valuable knowledge of the frontier. The Braddock expedition ended in disaster. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's army was ambushed by French and native forces near Fort Duquesne. The British regulars, trained to fight in European-style linear formations, were cut to pieces by enemy fire from the forest. Braddock, himself mortally wounded, the army broke and fled in panic. Washington, one of the few British officers to emerge with his reputation enhanced, helped organize the retreat, despite having 2 horses shot out from under him and his coat pierced by 4 musket balls. Meanwhile, both empires were mobilizing in Europe. France secured alliances with Austria and Russia through a series of diplomatic agreements that reversed centuries of Austrian-French enmity, a complete realignment of European power that became known as the Diplomatic Revolution. Britain allied with Prussia, seeking a counterweight to French power. In 1756, Britain formally declared war on France. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, had begun in earnest. But everyone understood that the true beginning had been 2 years earlier, in an obscure Pennsylvania glen, when a young Virginia officer had led an attack that killed a French ensign.
A global conflagration. The 7 Years' War would prove to be the first truly global conflict, fought on 5 continents and across 3 oceans. In North America, British and colonial forces fought French and Canadian troops alongside their respective native allies, battling for control of the continent from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. In Europe, massive armies clashed in campaigns that ranged from the Rhine to Bohemia, from Saxony to Silesia. In the Caribbean, British and French forces fought for control of sugar islands. In West Africa, they battled over slave trading posts. In India, British and French companies' private armies fought for dominance over the subcontinent. In the Philippines, Spanish and British forces battled after Spain entered the war as a French ally. The casualty estimates are staggering and imprecise, as they always are for 18th century conflicts, but historians generally accept that some 1.4 million people died as a result of the war. Soldiers killed in battle, civilians caught in the crossfire, populations devastated by disease and famine that followed in the wake of armies. Cities were besieged,
Territories changed hands repeatedly. Entire populations were displaced. In North America, the war was particularly brutal. Native peoples were caught between empires, forced to choose sides, promised support that often failed to materialize, and ultimately abandoned by whichever European power proved victorious. European settlers faced raids on their frontier farms, with families killed or captured, homesteads burned. French-Canadian communities watched British armies advance up the St. Lawrence toward the heart of New France. The turning point came in 1759, when British forces under General James Wolfe defeated the French under the Marquis de Montcalm on the plains of Abraham outside Quebec City. Both generals died in the battle, but British victory secured Canada for Britain. Montreal fell the following year, and French power in North America was effectively broken. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, ended the war and redrew the map of the world. France ceded all of its North American territories east of the Mississippi to Britain, except for two small fishing islands off Newfoundland. France gave New Orleans and its territories west of the Mississippi to Spain as compensation for Spanish losses in the war. Britain gained control of Canada, the Ohio Country, and Florida. The French colonial empire in North America, built over 150 years of exploration and trade, had essentially ceased to exist. But the British victory came at an enormous cost. The war had drained the British treasury, leaving the government with massive debts. Parliament decided that the American colonies, which had benefited from the expulsion of the French, should help pay for the war through new taxes. The Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1767, these attempts to raise revenue from the colonies would spark resistance and resentment. The colonists, who had fought alongside British regulars during the war, had gained military experience and a sense of their own capabilities. They had seen British generals make mistakes, had watched British armies defeated by frontier fighters. They had developed a certain confidence, a belief that they could defend themselves and govern their own affairs. The war had also removed the French threat that had made British protection necessary. When France controlled Canada and the Ohio Country, the American colonists needed British military support against a powerful enemy. With France defeated and expelled from North America, that need disappeared. The colonists were less dependent on Britain, less willing to accept British authority, less tolerant of British taxes and regulations. George Washington, who had begun the war as a young, ambitious colonial officer, desperate for British recognition and a commission in the regular army, emerged from it as a seasoned military commander with a reputation throughout the colonies. He had learned hard lessons about military leadership, about the differences between colonial and British military culture, about the difficulties of frontier warfare. These lessons would serve him well 2 decades later, when he would lead a different army against British regulars. The British writer Horace Walpole captured the terrible irony in a single sentence, written in 1754, as news of the clash at Jumonville Glen reached London. The volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire. It was a remarkably prescient observation. That brief engagement in the obscure glen, that 15 minutes of violence on a misty May morning, had indeed ignited a global conflagration. The musket fire that echoed off the rocks of Jumonville Glen would reverberate around the world, reshaping empires, redrawing maps, and ultimately setting in motion the forces that would lead to American independence. The site today. Today, Jumonville Glen remains much as it was that morning in 1754.
The forest and the rock formations that made up the French campsite are virtually unchanged. Trees have grown and fallen, seasons have turned, centuries have passed, but the essential character of the place remains constant. The stone cliff still rises above the narrow valley floor, its ancient layers of Burgoon sandstone showing the same cross beds and vertical fractures that were there when Washington's men looked down from the heights above. The trees still whisper in the wind. The ground is still steep and treacherous. The site is now part of Fort Necessity National Battlefield, administered by the National Park Service. It is designated as a subunit of the main fort site, located 7 miles to the southeast. The National Park Service maintains a small parking area and a trail that leads down into the glen where the engagement occurred. The trail itself is a half-mile loop that descends from the parking area, winds through the glen where the French camp was located, and then climbs back up to the parking area. It is not an easy walk. The trail is steep in places, with steps carved into the hillside to help visitors navigate the descent. The footing is uneven, with rocks and roots crossing the path. On rainy days, the trail becomes slippery, giving modern visitors a small taste of the conditions Washington's men faced. Interpretive markers along the trail explain the events of May 28, 1754. They describe the disposition of forces, the tactics employed, the violence that unfolded. They present multiple perspectives, British, French, and native, acknowledging the complexity of the historical record and the different ways this event has been remembered and interpreted. At the bottom of the glen, near where the French camp was located, there is a sense of enclosure, of being surrounded and overlooked. Standing there, it is easy to understand the tactical situation, to see why the French position was so vulnerable, to imagine Washington's men firing down from the rocks and trees above. The stone cliff still looms overhead, and the steep hillsides rise on 3 sides. It is quiet. The sounds of traffic and civilization fade away, leaving only natural sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, perhaps the trickle of water after rain. The site is open seasonally, typically from May through October, though visitors can walk the trail year-round if they wish. In winter, snow covers the glen, transforming it into a silent white landscape where the only tracks are those of deer and other wildlife. In spring, wildflowers bloom among the rocks. In summer, the canopy creates deep shade, and the forest is alive with insects and birdsong. In fall, the leaves turn brilliant colors, red maple, yellow hickory, orange oak, creating a spectacular display before falling to carpet the forest floor. Historical interpretation. The battle at Jumonville Glen and its aftermath have been interpreted and reinterpreted by historians for more than 2.5 centuries. The event is complex enough, and the sources contradictory enough that it resists simple narratives. Was it a legitimate military engagement or an assassination? Was Washington a young officer doing his duty, or a reckless commander who blundered into war? Was Jumonville a diplomat or a spy? Was Tenacharason a British ally or an independent actor pursuing his own agenda? Early American historians, writing in the 19th century when nationalism ran high, tended to portray Washington in heroic terms. He had acted decisively to defend British interests against French aggression. He had shown courage and leadership in difficult circumstances. His signed confession at Fort Necessity was explained away as the result of poor translation and French trickery. The violence perpetrated by Tanacharison's warriors was often downplayed or ignored entirely.
reflecting the racist attitudes of the era that saw native peoples as savage and beyond the bounds of civilized warfare. French and French-Canadian historians took a different view. They emphasized Jumonville's diplomatic mission, portrayed his killing as murder, and held Washington personally responsible for violating the laws of war. They saw the events at Jumonville Glen as evidence of British perfidy, of the lawless violence that characterized British colonial expansion, of the casual brutality with which British colonials treated both French and native peoples. Modern historians have attempted to navigate between these nationalistic interpretations, looking at the events from multiple perspectives and acknowledging ambiguities in the historical record. They note that frontier warfare in the 18th century operated under different rules than European warfare, that the line between peace and war was often unclear, that participants on both sides were motivated by complex mixtures of duty, ambition, fear, and self-interest. Washington's later reflections. George Washington rarely spoke about Jumonville Glen in later years. After he became a national figure, as the commander of the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War, as President of the Constitutional Convention, as the first President of the United States, he had many opportunities to reflect on his military career and recount his experiences. He wrote extensively about other battles and campaigns, but Jumonville Glen remained a subject he avoided. When pressed, Washington maintained that he had acted properly, that the French were hostile, that the attack was justified by military necessity. He insisted that Jumonville was a spy rather than a diplomat, that the French claims about a diplomatic mission were merely a cover story concocted after the fact. He downplayed his own role in the post-battle violence, portraying Tanacharisson's actions as beyond his control. But one senses, reading between the lines of Washington's later correspondence, a certain discomfort with the events of that morning. Perhaps it was guilt over the violence that followed the battle. Perhaps it was regret over signing the confession at Fort Necessity. Perhaps it was simply the knowledge that his first independent command had been a disaster that had helped precipitate a world war. Whatever his private thoughts, Washington never publicly acknowledged any wrongdoing at Jumonville Glen. He was, by the time anyone cared to ask him about it in detail, too important a figure to admit to such a potentially damaging mistake. The father of his country could not be portrayed as someone who had committed murder or precipitated war through reckless action. The mythology required a heroic narrative, and Washington, whether genuine belief or political necessity, provided one. The native perspective. For Tanacharisson and the Mingo people, Jumonville Glen represented both an opportunity and ultimately a disappointment. Tanacharissson had hoped that by allying with the British and helping Washington attack the French, he could shift the balance of power in the Ohio country, creating space for native autonomy between the two European empires. But events did not unfold as he hoped. The British defeat at Fort Necessity demonstrated that they were not strong enough to challenge French power. The subsequent arrival of Braddock's expedition and its catastrophic defeat in 1755 further proved British weakness. Tanacharisson died later in 1754, his dreams of maintaining Mingo independence unrealized. For the broader native peoples of the Ohio country, the war that followed Jumonville Glen was catastrophic. They were forced to choose sides between empires, and whichever side they chose, they lost. Those who allied with the French found themselves abandoned when France was defeated. Those who allied with the British found that British victory brought a flood of settlers into their territories, destroying hunting grounds and displacing native communities. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 was negotiated entirely between European powers, with no native representatives present. The French ceded territories they had never actually controlled, territories that were home to native peoples who had never consented to French sovereignty in the first place. Native peoples found their homelands transferred from one European empire to another, as if they were empty wilderness rather than inhabited lands with their own political structures and sovereign peoples. The war that began at Jumonville Glen ultimately accelerated the dispossession of native peoples from the Ohio country. The British victory removed the French, who had at least needed native allies and therefore had treated native peoples with some degree of respect. The British, once they had defeated France, no longer needed native allies and could pursue policies focused entirely on settlement and expansion.